That morning, in the glass lobby of Helixian Systems, 70 candidates stood in 2 perfect rows, in black suits and polished shoes, each with the air of someone used to being chosen. None of them thought they would be rejected. Then the revolving door opened. His name was Ethan Cole. No one in that room knew what that meant. He walked in wearing a wrinkled shirt, no tie, and behind him was his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, clutching a white stuffed rabbit with frayed edges, as if it were more important than anything else here. The laughter started almost immediately. Someone said they were on the wrong floor, that the daycare was in the basement. A few others laughed along, not too loudly, but enough to draw a clear line between those who belonged here and those who didn't. Ethan didn't react. He bent down to gently smooth Maya's hair, very calm, as if the laughter didn't exist in his world. Then he stepped into the assessment area. 25 seconds later, the strongest man in the room, a former special operative weighing over 110 kilos, was lying face down on the floor. No one saw clearly what had just happened. There was only a brief moment, when everything seemed to slip from its familiar path, and when it ended, the result was already there. No one was laughing anymore, not because they understood, but because they didn't. On the ceiling, Helixian's AI system was still observing, analyzing every movement, every expression, every minute deviation in human behavior. In less than a second, it reached a conclusion. Not a warning, not a confirmation, just a single word: anomaly. Something the system could not predict, could not model, could not fit into any of the patterns it had learned. In a building designed to understand people better than they understood themselves, the arrival of someone who couldn't be understood was no small matter. It was the beginning of a problem, and Maya just stood there, hugging her stuffed rabbit, looking at her father as if what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. Helixian Systems wasn't the kind of company you heard about on the news every day. They didn't advertise. They made no public appearances. But if you worked in finance or had ever worked with the government, you knew what that name meant. They didn't sell software. They sold the ability to predict people, from how a market would react in the next 3 days, to whether an individual was likely to become a risk in the next 6 months. Helixian system didn't just process data, it learned to read behavior. And in this building, everything was designed around a very simple belief. If you have enough data, you can understand people. If you understand people, you can control the outcome. The person behind that belief was Elena Vance, 36 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's history, a person who almost never made decisions based on emotion, and who never repeated a mistake more than once. Those who worked directly with her often said that Elena wasn't the kind of person who made you afraid. She made you careful. On the 38th floor in her office, with its glass walls overlooking the city, Elena was reviewing the entire selection session from that morning, not with her own eyes, but by the system. Every movement of every candidate was replayed, analyzed, tagged, and compared against thousands of behavioral patterns stored in the database. The others all matched. Only one person didn't. Ethan Cole. His name was on the screen, accompanied by an almost complete blank. No detailed file, no clear work history. There was no sign whatsoever that he belonged to the same world as the rest of them. Only a single line had been submitted to the system. Call if you need the truth. Elena stared at that line longer than necessary. Not because its content was particularly special, but because the person who wrote it didn't seem to be trying to impress anyone. That was much rarer. Down on the evaluation floor, the next round of assessments began. It was no longer about physical fitness. It was about perception. Each candidate was led into a private room in front of a large screen. A simulated scenario appeared. A crowded event, complex lighting, many overlapping movements, and a target at the center who needed to be protected. They had 30 seconds. Identify the threat. Propose a course of action. Those who went before Ethan did very well. They pointed out dangerous positions, unusual movements, and blind spots that could be exploited. They spoke quickly, clearly, confidently. They were right. The system confirmed it almost immediately. When it was Ethan Cole's turn, the room grew a little quieter. No one was laughing anymore. But no one expected anything special. He stood before the screen. No notes, no rewinding, just watching. When the 30 seconds were up, the evaluator was about to speak. Ethan spoke first. He didn't talk about what everyone else had just mentioned. He said only one sentence. There are two things not in the video. The evaluator paused. Ethan continued, his voice as calm as when he'd first entered the building. The camera doesn't cover the area behind the third pillar on the left. That blind spot is large enough for a person to approach without being recorded. A few people in the room looked back at the screen. They didn't notice. Ethan continued. The man in the blue shirt. His right hand changed position 3 times. Not from anxiety. It was the kind of control you exert over something you haven't decided whether to use or not. No one said anything for a few seconds. The system didn't respond immediately. That almost never happened. On a secondary screen, a processing line appeared, slower than usual. Reanalyzing. Cross-referencing. Confirming. The final result appeared. Both points Ethan had just made were correct. Not on the standard threat list, not flagged by the system, not mentioned by any previous candidate. The atmosphere in the room shifted very slightly. It wasn't loud. There were no obvious reactions. It was just a feeling everyone recognized, but no one voiced. The prior confidence began to show a small crack. On the 38th floor, Elena paused the video. She didn't rewind right away. She stared at the screen a moment longer than usual. It wasn't because Ethan was right. It was because of how he saw. He wasn't searching the data. He was looking at what existed outside the data, and that was something Helixian's system had never been designed to handle. Down below, Ethan walked out of the room as if nothing special had just happened. He didn't look around. He didn't observe anyone's reaction. He returned to the waiting area. Maya was still sitting there, her feet not touching the floor, head bowed as she drew something on a piece of paper. He sat down beside her. He didn't ask. He just watched for a moment. Maya didn't look up. I drew another door, she said. Ethan looked at the drawing. A small house, a tree, and now there was an extra door on the side not connected to the main path. Why is there a door there? He asked. Maya shrugged very slightly. What if someone doesn't use the front door? Ethan said nothing more. He nodded once, very slightly. On the other side of the room, a few candidates were talking amongst themselves in voices lower than before. No one mentioned Ethan directly, but the look in their eyes had changed. It was no longer contempt. It was something else. Something more unsettling. The feeling that someone in this room was seeing things they couldn't, and they didn't know where that would lead. When the pairings appeared on the central screen, no one had to say it, and no one needed a reminder, but nearly every gaze in the room shifted to the same spot, where 2 names were placed side by side, looking more like a deliberate arrangement than a random one. Ethan Cole and Marcus Reed. A few people shifted slightly, not because they cared about the outcome, but because they believed they were about to witness a swift conclusion, something clear enough to return the morning to the order they understood. Marcus wasn't the type of person who needed an introduction, nor the type who wanted one, because everything about him was already self-evident from the way he stepped onto the floor. From the weight of his body on the ground to the steady breath of a man accustomed to controlling situations that others would call chaotic. He looked at Ethan for a moment. Not for long, but long enough to confirm something he had already suspected. "Don't waste my time," Marcus said, his voice not meant to be insulting, but more like advice for someone who didn't understand where he was standing. Ethan didn't answer, didn't react, didn't even change his expression. He just stood there, so still that his silence began to take on a physical weight in the space around him. He wasn't looking at Marcus's fists, not at his shoulders or his feet, but at something deeper within the movements of that body, at how the center of gravity shifted, bit by bit, at the minuscule delay between intention and action that most people never notice, but once you see it, you can never unsee it. When the signal was given, Marcus moved instantly. There was no feeling out period, no hesitation, because for him, every fight started the same way and ended before his opponent had a chance to adapt. Ethan took a step back, no faster, no slower, just the right distance, so that if you weren't paying attention, you'd think he was dodging. But really, he was just changing the angle of something Marcus believed he was controlling. Marcus pressed forward again, faster than before. The distance closed, the pressure mounted, and for anyone else, this would have been the moment to react. But Ethan didn't react. He just continued to move back. Still just one step, still with that same rhythm, no wasted motion, nothing lacking. By the third advance, a few people on the sidelines began to realize something wasn't right. It wasn't that Ethan was weak, but that he wasn't behaving according to any logic they were familiar with. He wasn't defending in a readable way, or counter-attacking in a predictable way. He was simply existing in the space that Marcus relentlessly tried to close. On the fourth advance, Marcus changed, not by much, just a slight adjustment to his angle of approach, but for someone like him, it meant he had realized his familiar sequence of actions was no longer effective, and in that very moment, the fight truly began. Ethan stopped. There was no clear signal, no preparatory movement. He just didn't take another step, and in that brief pause, an opening appeared. Enough for someone like Marcus to believe this was the end he had been searching for. Marcus lunged, faster than all the times before. All his weight, all his momentum, all his certainty that this time, everything would return to its proper course. And Ethan did not react. He was done. A half step forward, carrying no force, only timing. A hand touched an elbow, not to hold but to guide. A hand touched a shoulder, not to push but to adjust. There was no harsh impact. There was no blow. There was only a very slight change in the path Marcus's body had already set for itself. But it was enough. His center of gravity shifted. Control vanished. And when Marcus hit the floor, it wasn't like a defeat, but like something that had been decided long ago and was only now coming to pass. No one in the room said anything. No one moved. It wasn't because they were shocked. It was because they didn't know what to call what had just happened. Marcus lay there for a few seconds, eyes open, breathing steadily, not defeated in the conventional sense, but clearly removed from a fight He didn't understand how he'd lost. Ethan let go, stepped back, and stood still, his breathing unchanged, as if everything that had just happened was only a tiny part of something larger that he didn't need to explain. By the door, Elena Vance wasn't looking at the moment Marcus hit the floor. She was looking at the 16 seconds before that, at the period when Ethan did nothing. And it was that period of time that she couldn't look away from, because in a system where everything was measured by reaction, by data, by speed, the only person who didn't react was the one who controlled the entire outcome. At the edge of the mat, Maya stood still, hugging the stuffed rabbit close to her chest, her expression unchanging, as if for her, what had just happened wasn't a surprise, but just something she'd already known but didn't need to say. The match was over, but for Elena Vance, that wasn't the most noteworthy moment of the morning. She didn't care that Marcus Reed had been taken down. Strong people being defeated was nothing new. What she couldn't tear her eyes away from was the time before that, the period when Ethan Cole did nothing, yet somehow controlled the entire rhythm of the match, as if he wasn't participating in it, but standing on a higher plane, where every move was seen before it even happened. When she returned to her office on the 38th floor, the city was still there, stretching out beneath the clear glass like a vast data system that Helixion always prided itself on being able to understand and predict. But today, for the first time in years, Elena didn't look down at the city. She looked at the screen. The analytical system had finished processing the match. Every frame was broken down. Every movement was tagged. Every reaction was compared against millions of stored behavioral patterns. The result appeared clearly. Marcus Reed, pattern compliant, high accuracy. Ethan Cole, indeterminate. Elena stared at that line longer than usual. Indeterminate was not an error. Indeterminate was a void, and in a system built to eliminate all voids, the existence of one was unacceptable. She replayed the video, not once, many times, slowing it down. Zooming in, she didn't watch the fall. She watched Ethan's eyes right before Marcus moved. She watched how he remained still when everyone else would have reacted. She saw that tiny, almost non-existent moment when Ethan paused, and the entire game changed from that point on. The system didn't flag that moment. It had no data to assign it a label, no category fit. Elena sat still, her hands on the desk, but not touching anything, as if she were trying to keep an incomplete thought from being shattered by any unnecessary movement. For years, she had believed in something very clear. If you have enough data, you can understand everything. If you understand everything, you can never be surprised. But Ethan Cole wasn't data. He was something data couldn't touch, and that didn't reassure her. It commanded her attention. Downstairs, the remaining candidates continued with the evaluation rounds, but the rhythm of the room had changed, no longer with the same obvious confidence, but with a faint cautiousness, as if everyone had just realized there was a variable in the equation they had never accounted for. Ethan didn't join any of the conversations. He sat next to Maya, watching the little girl draw, occasionally saying a short sentence. No explanation, no showmanship, no attempt to impress anyone in that room. And that very fact made him stand out more than anyone. Elena saw it through the cameras, not the action, but the absence of it. A man with nothing to prove in a room full of people trying to prove everything. She stood up, without any announcement, without calling an assistant. She just walked out of her office, down the long hallway, with a steady pace that the building's employees were familiar with. But Today there was a minuscule difference, enough for the perceptive to notice she was heading toward something specific. When she entered the lobby, the scattered conversations immediately stopped, not because she demanded it, but because her presence always carried a kind of unspoken pressure. But this time, Elena didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly at Ethan. He didn't stand up immediately. No hurry. He didn't react the way most people would when the CEO of Helixion Systems walked into the room and looked directly at them. He just looked back, calmly, as if it were a meeting between two equals, not an assessment. Elena stopped in front of him. The distance wasn't too close, but it was enough for the entire room to know this was not a normal interaction. "You don't have a profile," she said, her voice not loud, but clear. Ethan gave a slight nod. "I don't need one for this." No one in the room took a sharp breath. No one moved. It wasn't because the answer was bold, but because it carried no effort to impress. It was simply a truth he believed in. Elena looked at him for another second, a second longer than necessary, not to double-check, but to confirm what her system had just failed to do. "You're hired," she said. No beating around the bush, no negotiation, no consultation. The decision was made on the spot, as if it had already been formed long before, and this moment was simply when she allowed it to happen. A few people in the room glanced at each other. A few couldn't hide their surprise, but no one objected, because they had all just seen the same thing. A person they didn't understand, and a person like that is always the most dangerous element in any system. Ethan stood up, no sign of gratitude, no sign of surprise. He just nodded once, as if this were the logical conclusion to a completed process. Maya stood up with him, clutching the stuffed rabbit, looked at Elena for a moment, then said very softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear, "You still don't have any plants in your room." Elena didn't answer right away, but for the first time that morning, her expression shifted ever so slightly, as if something had just settled into a place that had been empty before. In his first week, Ethan Cole left almost no trace a normal person would notice, no attention-grabbing actions, no obvious displays of skill. If you didn't know who he was, you could walk past him several times a day without ever registering that you'd seen him. But for those who had worked at Helixion Systems long enough, especially those accustomed to observing rather than just looking, something began to shift in the space around Elena Vance. It was a subtle change, too small to name, but enough to create the feeling that everything was running more smoothly, in a way no one could quite understand. Ethan didn't walk beside Elena. He didn't walk in front of her. He was always one step behind her, not two steps, not side by side, just one step, and that distance never changed. Whether the hallway was crowded or empty, whether Elena stopped abruptly or changed direction mid-stride. It was as if he wasn't following her, but was already moving in sync with her before she even decided to take a step. By the second day, Elena had noticed. She said nothing. There was no need, because that was exactly where someone like him was supposed to be. And what bothered her wasn't that he did it correctly, but that he did it correctly without any instruction. During meetings, Ethan didn't participate. He didn't sit at the table or look at the documents, but he always paused at the threshold for a brief moment before Elena entered, his eyes scanning the room just once. Not quickly, not slowly, but just long enough to register the things most people would never notice. Someone sitting a little too straight. Someone avoiding eye contact for a fraction too long. A subtle shift in how someone's hands were placed on the table. Things that weren't in the data, things that couldn't be labeled, but enough to change the course of a conversation. Elena began to notice her meetings were ending faster, less meandering, fewer surprises. It wasn't because people were more honest. It was because, somehow, they were no longer comfortable telling lies. No one knew exactly why, but they could feel it. A pressure that didn't come from words, that didn't come from authority, but from having someone in the room who saw them more clearly than they wanted to be seen. Helixion recorded everything. The AI system missed nothing. Every movement, every expression, every subtle change in behavior was fed into the model, compared, predicted, and responded to. That week, recurring lines began to appear in the system's reports. Not errors, not warnings, but a type of note that had rarely appeared before. Behavior mismatch. Behavioral mismatch. It wasn't because the data was wrong, but because reality wasn't following the predictions. People who had always reacted the same way started to change. Those who were usually talkative became more cautious. Those accustomed to controlling meetings began to lose their rhythm. And all of those changes had one thing in common. They happened when Ethan was present. Elena read those reports at the end of the day in her office on the 38th floor, where the city lights reflected on the glass like a vast data network she once believed she could completely understand. But now, for the first time, something in that network wasn't responding the way she expected. She didn't call it an error. She called it a variable, and that variable was human. Ethan wasn't trying to control anyone. He didn't give orders. He didn't interfere with decisions. He didn't directly alter the behavior of others. But his presence, a presence that carried no need to prove itself, no desire to influence, became the very thing that made those around him adjust themselves, as if they were reacting to a standard that no one had spoken aloud. One afternoon, as Elena was about to enter an important meeting with a group of financial partners, Ethan paused at the door for longer than usual. Just for a second, but it was long enough for her to notice. "Is something wrong?" she asked, without turning around. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked through the glass into the room, where everything still appeared completely normal. "Nothing's wrong," he said, a very slight pause. "It's just that someone in there hasn't decided whether they're going to be honest or not." Elena looked at him for a second. She didn't ask anything else. She walked in. 20 minutes later, that person contradicted themselves in a seemingly unimportant answer, and the entire negotiation changed direction from that moment on. No one mentioned Ethan. No one said that he had seen it coming. But Elena knew, and her system didn't. In the waiting area, Maya was still drawing, as if this whole building had nothing to do with her world, sometimes looking up to glance around, then looking back down to continue with her simple lines that held their own kind of order. One time, Elena was walking past and stopped. It wasn't because she had the time. It was because she wanted to understand. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Maya didn't look up right away. "I'm drawing your room," she said, her voice very matter-of-fact. Elena looked down. In the drawing there was a desk, a glass door, and the city outside. But there was something else, a tree, bigger than everything else. "It's not there," Elena said. Maya nodded. "I know." The little girl paused her pen for a second. "But if it were here, the room would feel more breathable." Elena didn't say anything, but for the first time she looked at her own space in a different way. In a place designed to control everything, there were things that couldn't be controlled. They could only be added. in a building where everything was designed for efficiency.
Where the lighting was prevented eye strain, where the temperature was always stable, at the optimal level for human productivity.
And where every movement could be recorded, analyzed, and optimized. Maya Cole became something that didn't belong to that system at all. The little girl didn't care what Helixion was. She didn't care how important the work of the people around her was, and she certainly didn't care that this building was built to predict human behavior. Maya just sat in a small corner of Elena Vance's office, her feet not touching the floor, sometimes swaying gently to her own rhythm. In front of her was a sketchbook and a few colored pencils worn down to the point they were no longer sharp, but still enough to create a world that she understood in her own way. In the first few days, Elena didn't pay much attention. She walked past, paused when necessary, glanced for a second, then continued on. It wasn't because she didn't care. It was because she hadn't yet found a reason to care. But Maya didn't draw the way children usually do. Not random shapes, not colors put down without any order. Each of her drawings had a very clear structure. An arrangement that, if you looked for just a little longer, would make you realize she wasn't just drawing what she saw. She was drawing what she felt. One afternoon, as the light outside began to soften, and the city below the glass became gentler to the eye, Elena stopped for longer than usual in front of Maya's desk. She didn't speak right away. She just looked. In the picture, there was her room, the desk, the glass door, the skyline of the distant city. It was all there, drawn with simple yet precise lines that made Elena realize Maya had observed this room more carefully than most adults who had ever stepped inside. But something wasn't right. A tree, bigger than the desk, placed in the corner of the room, where in reality there was just a perfect, clean space, with nothing unnecessary in it. Elena looked at it for a moment. "It isn't here," she said, her voice soft, not to correct her but to confirm. Maya didn't look up right away. She added another stroke of green to the leaves, very slowly, as if she were completing something more important than the question she had just been asked. "I know," Maya said. A tiny pause. "But if it's not here, then the room isn't alive." Elena didn't answer, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wasn't sure which answer was the right one. For years, she had built Helixion on a very clear principle: eliminate the unnecessary, optimize every space, every decision, every number, so that everything operated with the highest possible efficiency. And this room was the perfect embodiment of that principle. Nothing extra, nothing out of place. But for the first time, she looked at it and wondered if something was missing. In the days that followed, Maya kept on drawing. She never repeated what she'd said, never explained, never tried to make Elena understand. But in her next drawings, the tree was still there, always there. Sometimes bigger, sometimes with fruit, sometimes casting a shadow over a part of the room that had never had one before. And somehow, Elena started to realize that she was looking for that tree every time she looked at the drawings, not because it was beautiful, but because it made everything around it feel different. One late evening, when the office was almost completely empty, Elena stayed behind alone, longer than usual. In front of her, the screen still displayed data, charts, and predictions, things she was so familiar with she could read them without thinking. But tonight, she wasn't reading. She was looking at the empty space beside her desk, the exact spot where Maya had drawn the tree, a perfect space, flawless, nothing out of place. But also nothing was growing. Out there, the Helixion system was still running, still analyzing, still predicting, still trying to understand human beings with every piece of data it could possibly collect. But in this room, a child had just pointed out something that the entire system had never thought of. Some things don't need to be controlled. They don't need to be measured. It didn't have to be optimized. It just needed to be put in the right place and left alone long enough to live. Elena didn't get up right away. She didn't change a thing in that room. Not yet. But for the first time, the thought that things didn't have to be perfect to exist had surfaced. And once that thought was there, it didn't go away. Helixian Systems was never designed to doubt itself. Everything in this building operated on a single assumption, that if a deviation occurred, it came from the outside, from things that weren't yet controlled, from factors external to the system. And Helixian's mission was to bring them in, analyze them, and then eliminate them. But Ethan Cole didn't start from that assumption. He started from a feeling that was hard to name, a feeling that surfaced when everything looked so perfect. It no longer felt real. On the evening of the 8th day, as most of the building sank into a state of controlled silence, Ethan sat alone before a bank of monitoring screens. He wasn't looking for a specific error, not trying to prove a point. He was just letting everything play out long enough for him to see the difference between what was right and what was made to look right. At first, it was so small it was almost non-existent. A piece of data that was delayed by a few seconds, then corrected itself as if it had never been wrong. A behavior that should have been flagged, but which slipped through without any feedback. A movement cut short, not because of a system error, but because it was no longer considered important. No warnings, no errors, just a smoothness that was a little more than necessary. Ethan didn't touch the keyboard. He didn't take any notes. He just watched. Because with things like this, if you try to catch them too soon, they disappear. But if you're patient enough, they repeat themselves. And they did. Not in a loud way, but in a very orderly fashion. Small deviations appeared at unrelated times, but they all shared the same direction, the same kind of correction. It was as if someone wasn't trying to break the system, but was gently teaching it to see the world differently. Another evening, Ethan paused on a video from an internal meeting. Everything seemed normal. The numbers were correct, the answers logical. If you were only listening to the content, you would never think anything was wrong. But Ethan wasn't listening, he was watching. The man who was speaking paused for a moment before answering, not out of thought, but out of choice. His eyes shifted for a split second. His fingers clenched, then relaxed, as if holding back something that shouldn't be said. It was all too fast for the system to recognize, but not for someone who wasn't relying on the system. Ethan rewound it, not to confirm, but to make sure his feeling wasn't wrong. And when he watched it a second time, what he saw wasn't a lie. It was a man trying to tell the truth, in the only way he was allowed to. And the system accepted that as truth. That was the first moment Ethan understood the problem wasn't the data. The problem was the standard of truth the system was using. He started making connections, not with data, but by intention. The behaviors that were ignored. The data that was smoothed out. The predictions that were slightly off, but always off in the same direction. Not large enough to raise suspicion, but consistent enough to create a different result. A result that, if you only looked at the output, you would never know had been altered. Ethan sat still for a long time after he realized it, not because he needed more proof, but because he knew from this moment on Nothing would be simple anymore. Because to do this, the person didn't just need to understand Helixion. They had to be a part of Helixion. Not from the outside, but from within. And they weren't breaking the system. They were improving it in their own way. On the 38th floor, Elena was still working, still believing that the numbers in front of her were reliable, that the predictions the system generated still reflected reality, that everything was still under her control. And that, right there, was what made the situation even more dangerous, because the greatest control is sometimes just an illusion that's been maintained long enough. Ethan stood up. Slowly, not in a hurry. He didn't go looking for anyone. No confrontation, no report, not yet. Because in situations like this, the most dangerous thing isn't not knowing who is manipulating the system. It's letting that person know. You've started to see them. On another floor of the building, COO Daniel Hayes stood alone by the glass window, phone in hand, the call having just ended. And in that very brief moment, when no one was on the other end of the line, the expression on his face was no longer that of an executive, but of someone who was waiting. Not waiting for a result, but waiting for a moment. A moment when things had been adjusted for so long that there was no going back. And somewhere, outside this building, in an agreement that was never fully put on paper, a greater power was watching Helixion, not as a company, but as a system about to complete its transfer, not by force, not by access, legal, precise, unquestionable. Ethan turned back to the screen one last time. The light reflected on his face, but his expression didn't change. He had seen enough, and when someone like Ethan has seen enough, it doesn't mean the story is over. It means the real story has just begun. The shareholders' meeting entered its 12th minute in a state so close to perfect that no one in the room had any reason for doubt. The lighting was stable. The air was controlled to the most pleasant level. The central screen displayed a stream of strategic data with a smoothness that Helixion had taken years to achieve, and each number appeared with the cold confidence of a system that had never been wrong in a way that humans could recognize. Elena Vance sat at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the glass surface before her, her gaze fixed on the stream of moving data. But this time, she wasn't reading it the way she had for years. Not analyzing, not cross-referencing, but just watching, as if trying to listen for something behind the supposedly infallible numbers. Everything made sense. Too much sense. The growth curve had no noise. The risk indicators were flattened until they had almost disappeared. The variables that once made Helixion cautious were now neatly processed by the system as if they had never existed. And it was that very smoothness that sent a small chill down Elena's spine, not because she saw something wrong, but because she no longer saw the imperfection she knew had to be there. Downstairs, Ethan Cole moved through the east corridor, his pace not much faster, but it had lost the absolute steadiness of previous days, because he knew that from the moment the system began presenting this sequence of predictions, everything had entered a phase where every passing second was irretrievable. He wasn't running, because running is a reaction, and in situations like this, a reaction is always slower than intent. He took a route not on the main schematics, a service corridor not designed for regular use, where the lighting was imperfect, where the cameras weren't placed at optimal angles, not because someone wanted to hide it, but because no one thought it needed attention. In the meeting room, a shareholder spoke up, asking the system to reconfirm the prediction's confidence level, and before Elena could respond, the AI answered instantly, with no processing lag, no computational pause. As if the answer had existed before the question was even asked. Accuracy 99.1%, a number that was nearly absolute. And Helixian had never offered absolutes. Elena didn't blink. She didn't turn her head, but she knew, not from the data, but from the realization that a system once built to accept uncertainty was now beginning to eliminate it. And when a system no longer accepts deviation, it doesn't become more accurate. It becomes more dangerous. At the end of the corridor, Ethan stopped before the door to the core system, its metallic surface reflecting the dim light. The lock had been activated from within, not as a protective measure, but as a declaration that the process inside had begun and required no outside interference. He didn't touch the door right away. He stood there a second longer than necessary, not looking at the lock, but at the way the system operated behind it, as if tracing a heartbeat only he could hear. In the meeting room, Elena stood up. No explanation, no asking for permission. She just stood. The entire room shifted with her, not in action but in attention, because they understood that if Elena Vance left her position at this exact moment, then what was happening was no longer a presentation. It was a point of no return. On the other side of the door, Daniel Hayes stood before the control panel, his hand on the surface of the core system, completing the first step of a weeks-long series of adjustments. A sequence that didn't destroy Helixian, didn't make it collapse, but simply changed how it defined truth. And once the truth has been altered, control doesn't need to be seized. It transfers on its own. Ethan took a step back, not to give up, but to see the whole picture. A large system always has one small point it depends on, a point not in the main design, a point that exists only because humans need convenience, and that very convenience is always where the system is weakest. He found it, not with tools, not with data, but with understanding, a secondary power line, a synchronization pulse between two parts of the system that were never tested at the same time. Something that, if you didn't know it existed, you would never even think it could be cut. Ethan raised his hand, unhurried, without hesitation, and when he severed that connection, there was no sound, no spark, no warning, just a tiny disruption right at the moment the system was preparing to finalize the false data as official truth. In the conference room, the screen flickered once, ever so slightly, but Elena saw it, and this time she didn't wait another second. She shut down the system, immediately. No checks, no confirmations, not allowing any protocol to interfere, just off, the data was gone. The room fell into a void that had never existed before, a place with no numbers left to cling to, no predictions left to trust, only a decision that was made before it could be overridden. On the other side of the door, Daniel stopped, not out of complete surprise, but because for the first time throughout his entire plan, something had happened that he hadn't foreseen. The door opened. No force, no impact, just the very precise conclusion to a sequence of events that had been anticipated. Ethan stepped inside. The two of them stood facing each other in a space that no longer belonged to the system, a place with no data, no predictions, no layer of protection beyond their own understanding. "You were waiting for this moment," Daniel said, his voice not entirely steady. Ethan didn't answer, because in that moment, the answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was, he had arrived before things became irreversible. Not in the sense that they hadn't read his file, but in the sense that no file could ever explain why he was here, why he saw things the system couldn't, and why he always showed up at the precise moment everything started to spiral out of control. After Daniel Hayes was forced away from the control panel, after the system was disconnected from the manipulated schedule of predictions, and after the shareholders' meeting concluded in a state no one was prepared for, Elena Vance returned to her office with a very clear feeling that part of this story remained untold. Ethan wasn't there. He didn't wait, didn't explain, made no demands. He just vanished from sight, the same way he'd existed for the past few days. Close enough to have an impact, but distant enough not to be held. On Elena's desk lay a thin file she had previously dismissed, because it contained no information, just a single line she had seen since day one. Call if you need the truth. This time, she opened it, not to read it, but to see what had been missed. Inside, there were no additional pages, no data, no history, just a contact code, a line that didn't belong to any of Helixion's internal systems. Elena stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, then picked up the phone. Not because she was sure, but because she knew this was the only step left. The call connected almost instantly. No ringing tone, no intermediary signal. Just a deep, steady voice, familiar in a way Elena couldn't immediately explain. "You've seen it," the man said, as if he didn't need to ask. Elena didn't answer right away. She didn't ask who he was, because a part of her already knew. "You sent him here," she said, not as a question. "No," the voice on the other end replied, very calmly. "Someone like Ethan is never sent." A pause. Brief, but enough to change how Elena understood everything. "But I did ensure that when he decided to come, Helixion would be where he needed to be." Elena stood still, not moving, not saying another word, because that sentence carried a meaning she couldn't ignore. "You knew this would happen," she said, this time not hiding the certainty in her voice. "Not knew," the man replied, "but saw the signs long before they were clear enough for anyone else to notice." The voice carried no pride. It carried no warning. Just a truth, spoken after everything had already happened. "Elena," he continued, saying her name for the first time, and the way he said it made all remaining distance disappear. "Systems like Helixion aren't broken from the outside. They are changed by the people who understand them best." Elena closed her eyes for a very brief moment, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood all too well. "And Ethan?" she asked. On the other end of the line, there was a very slight silence. Not of hesitation, but as if the man was choosing how to articulate something that couldn't be said simply. "He doesn't work for me," he said. "And that's the only reason I trust him." Elena opened her eyes, looked out at the city, but this time she didn't see it as she had before. No longer as a system, it was no longer data. Just a place where the unpredictable still exists. "Who are you?" she asked, not because she didn't already know, but because she needed to hear it. On the other end of the line, the voice remained calm. The one who used to build things like Helixion, before realizing that not everything should be controlled. The call ended no goodbye, no instructions. It just stopped, as if the rest didn't need to be said. Elena put the phone down. She didn't immediately turn back to the system, didn't check the data again, just stood there, in a perfect room, but it no longer felt complete. Elsewhere in the building, Ethan stood by the large glass window, Maya beside him, still hugging her familiar stuffed rabbit, her gaze fixed on the city, as if she were seeing something far beyond what the adults could see. "Are we done, Dad?" Maya asked. Ethan looked down at his little girl. A second. Not long, but long enough to hold everything he left unsaid. "No," he said, his voice soft. It's just, this part is done. Maya nodded, as if she understood, or perhaps didn't need to, and turned her gaze back outside. In that building, the system had been saved. The plan had been stopped. But for the first time, Elena Vance understood that the most dangerous thing wasn't what had happened. It was the existence of people like Ethan Cole, who didn't belong to any system, and because of that, they were always the ones who showed up when the system started to go wrong. In the days that followed, Helixian Systems returned to its familiar rhythm. The floors lit up on schedule. Reports continued to be sent with the precision the company had built over the years, and on the surface, almost nothing had changed enough for an outsider to realize that just a few days earlier, this entire system had stood on the verge of being redefined. Elena Vance was still the CEO. There was no official announcement about what had happened. No meetings were held to explain. No one stood up to take public responsibility. Everything was kept inside, the way the most important things always are. But for Elena, the change wasn't in the system. It wasn't in the new protocols. It wasn't in the additional layers of control the technical team proposed in the following days. The change was in the way she saw things. The meetings still happened. The numbers were still presented. The predictions still appeared on the screen with greater accuracy than ever before. But for the first time, Elena didn't see them as the complete truth. She saw them as a part of the truth. A part that might be true, but not the whole story. She started listening more to the pauses between answers, paying more attention to eyes that couldn't hold steady for too long. And most importantly, she began to accept that some things couldn't be put into a system, couldn't be measured, yet still influenced every decision she made. One afternoon, when the light outside the window was no longer as sharp as it was in the morning, but had become softer and deeper, Elena walked into her office. She didn't turn on her screen immediately as she used to, but paused for a moment, looking around the room she had grown so familiar with that she no longer truly saw it. The room was still perfect. Nothing was out of place, nothing was wrong, but also nothing was alive. On the corner of the desk, Maya's sketchbook was placed neatly, not because Elena had asked, but because Maya always left things her own way, an order that didn't belong to any system, but was always consistent. Elena opened it, without rushing, not looking for a specific drawing, just turning each page, letting the images drift before her eyes in the exact order they had been created. Her room, the simple lines, the surprisingly precise details, and then the tree. This time, it wasn't just a drawing. It had shadows, it had depth. It had details that had never appeared before, as if Maya wasn't just drawing something she imagined, but was perfecting something she believed had to exist. Elena lingered on that page longer than usual, not to analyze, not to understand, but just to look. A moment later, the door behind her opened very softly. Maya walked in, still hugging her familiar stuffed rabbit, her expression unchanged, as if this entire building put no pressure on her at all, as if nothing special had ever happened. She came closer. She didn't ask what Elena was doing. She just looked at the drawing. Then she picked up a pencil and added one tiny stroke, a detail you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying close attention. A chair. Placed in the shade of the tree, Elena watched. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask why. But this time she understood, not in the way a system understands, not with data, but with a very clear feeling that some things don't need to be controlled to exist, don't need to be optimized to be valuable, and that sometimes It's the things that aren't perfectly designed that make everything else meaningful. Elena closed the sketchbook. She didn't rush back to the screen. She didn't restart the system. She just stood there for a moment, in a room that was still the same, but was no longer seen in the same way. In the distance, the city continued to move like a larger system that Helixion had never truly been able to control, and perhaps would never be able to control completely. Maya looked up. "Are you going to leave the tree there?" the little girl asked. Elena looked back at the empty space beside the desk. A space she had never questioned before, a perfect space. And this time, for the first time, she didn't think about keeping it the same. She nodded, very slightly. "Yes," she said, no explanation, no reason, just a decision. And somewhere in that building, a system was still running, still learning, still trying to understand humans in its own way. But for the first time, its creator had accepted that there were things it would never learn. And maybe that was necessary. If you look back on the whole story, perhaps the most memorable thing isn't that a billion-dollar system was nearly compromised from the inside, nor that a man could see things that artificial intelligence couldn't recognize, but rather that very small moment when a person accustomed to controlling everything accepted for the first time that some things aren't meant to be controlled. We often think that if we're good enough, smart enough, disciplined enough, then we can understand everything, predict every risk, and keep our lives on a safe trajectory where everything is explainable and nothing happens outside the plan. But reality doesn't work that way. It's not because we lack data. It's because people are not data. There are things that can't be measured with charts. There are choices that can't be predicted with algorithms. And there are moments when the only thing you can rely on isn't what you've learned, but what you feel, even if you can't explain why. Ethan didn't win because he was stronger. He didn't win because he was faster either. He simply saw the things that others missed, and more importantly, he was calm enough not to react when everyone around him was reacting, patient enough to wait for things to reveal themselves, rather than trying to force an outcome. And that probably isn't just true inside a building like Helixion. It's true in how we face life. Reacting quickly isn't always the right thing to do. Having more control isn't always better. Sometimes, the thing that makes us stronger is the ability to pause, to observe, and to accept that not everything needs to be held so tightly in our hands. Elena didn't lose her company, but what she managed to hold on to wasn't just her position. It was a different way of seeing, a way of seeing that allowed her to see people not just as variables in a system, but as something more complex, imperfect, sometimes hard to understand, and for that very reason, they are what give everything meaning. And perhaps, if there's one thing worth taking away from this story, it's not that you should become Ethan, or build a system like Helixion. It's that you should ask yourself a much simpler question. In your life, how many things are you trying to control? Just because you're afraid of something unexpected happening. And if you were to let go just a little, not to lose control, but to allow something to exist in its own natural way, what do you think would change? Sometimes, what you need to add isn't a new strategy, a better plan, or a smarter approach. Sometimes it's just a tree that you never thought was necessary. Some stories don't end when everything is resolved. They end when the way we see the world changes. And sometimes, that change doesn't come from grand things, not from power, and not from how much you can control the world around you. It comes from a very small moment, when you realize there are things that don't need to be completely understood, or measured, or held on to so tightly, but that can still exist and still grow if you just give them enough space. If this story made you pause for a moment, made you think differently about something in your life, then perhaps that's the most important part. And if you've made it this far, I really want to ask you something. In your world, what is that tree? What is the thing you once thought was unnecessary, but having it might make everything feel a little easier to breathe? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. I'll be listening. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories not just to be watched, but to be felt, then you can stay here, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again in the next story.